So we had lesson 0. Before getting into lesson 1, I kind of want to just touch back at lesson 0. I watched a video recently, and the guy who was doing it was a short one, but the guy who was basically presenting this video talked about personal finance and achieving financial independence. And his take was that it's 80% thought process and behavior and 20% knowledge. It's kind of interesting. I didn't think about it that way, but I think it's probably true. Without the right thought processes and behavior, the knowledge almost doesn't matter. I guess the best example of that is lots of people do things that they know are bad for them, but they do them anyway. And the same is true in finance. There's lots of ways in which you can behave badly, and you know they're bad, but you do them anyway. Everybody does it. So I just wanted to sort of recap that a little bit. And if you haven't watched lesson 0, I would encourage you to do it and internalize it. And if there's something you want to talk about there, then let's do that. Notwithstanding, knowledge is still important because it helps you make better decisions. Not that you have to memorize all this stuff. That's not necessary. What's necessary is that you're kind of like aware of these principles, and therefore you can become curious about the implications of some of them and apply them to your own situation. Curiosity being an important thing, because that's what motivates you to ask questions and dig deeper and learn more. So anyway, we'll get into lesson 1. This is first of a bunch of lessons, and it's about establishing a basic understanding of some principles that matter. And it's probably going to seem a little bit, what's the word, sort of a bit basic and kind of not exciting at all. In fact, this is true of most of this, like sensible investing and sensible financial management should not be exciting. You shouldn't be on the edge, sitting in your chair worrying if the stock's going to go up or down, or worrying if you can, buy a loaf of bread. That if you're in that state where it's exciting, you're probably doing it wrong. So apologies in advance, because this isn't particularly not eye-catching. It doesn't keep your attention. You might have to sort of motivate yourself to pay attention, but that's just the way it is. So what we're going to cover in this one, lesson 1, is probably one of the most important principles is this notion of time value of money. There are certain topics which I've listed on this slide here that relate to time value of money, but it is the underlying principle that sort of drives most of the financial models that come after it. And it's just a consequence of how the value of money changes as a function of time. It's kind of interesting to ask yourself, well, why does that have to be the case? Well, it kind of has to be the case because the size of economies over the world are changing constantly. Usually they're getting bigger. Sometimes they shrink. That's called a recession, when the size of the economy shrinks. But as the population grows and the size of the economy grows with it, that creates opportunity. It creates the opportunity for assets to increase in price. It also creates the opportunity in an inflationary context for cash to decrease in value over time. And that's an important principle that really is what comes out of this notion of time value for money. And there's a few other topics here: present value, future value, discount rates, opportunity cost, and compounding, that we'll discuss in this lesson. So to introduce the idea, really there's just a few sort of silly questions here that I'm not going to read. You can read them yourselves. I'll leave the slide there for a bit. But it's inviting you again to become curious about a few principles here. So how much would you give me now if I was in return going to promise to give you $100 a year from now? Or how much would you pay me now if I was going to give you $100 a year for 25 years or for the rest of your life? How would you even figure that out? What's it worth? Imagine you're going to live to 80 years old. You're mid-30s now, so let's say you got 45 years left. So I'm going to give you $100 every year for 45 years. So that would be $4,500. How much would you pay me now in return for that $4,500? How would you establish a value for that? Then you get into the idea of comparing different investments. How do you determine which is a better investment? And it's just a couple of examples there that invite you to think about that. And then there's some other scenarios here, like you just get a lump of cash that comes in your life. What's the best way to dispose of that cash or invest that cash? How do you use it? Should I pay off credit cards or should I invest it in the stock market? Should I pay down a mortgage or should I do something else with it? And the principle of time value for money helps answer these questions and many other questions that are of a similar nature. A bunch of definitions here. Again, I don't think I'll read all these. You can read them yourselves. A couple of things I will talk about. The present value is like today. How much is something worth today? So think back to the conversation about the $100 a year for life. How much is that worth today? Future value is if I'm saving up and I'm investing. Instead of receiving cash, I'm putting it somewhere. I'm going to put money into real estate or the stock market, or I'm just going to put it in the bank. How much is it going to be worth in the future? Like 15 years from now, if I'm saving $100 a month, at a rate of return of 3%, how much is that worth in the future? And we'll talk about all this. Discount rate is it's essentially a factor which reduces the value of money that you receive in the future. Again, rather than try to elaborate that now, we'll get into it. Risk is the idea of unpredictability. It is essentially the extent to which present or future value is in doubt. It's subjective. It can't be objectively quantified. You can't say the risk is 53 or the risk is 27. Risk is a kind of like a blend between personal factors and environmental factors. It talks about your own personal financial situation. It talks about the types of things you're doing in the world and the state of the world and what's happening in the economy, what's happening politically. What else will I mention here? Net present value, there's an interesting one. So net present value is the difference between the value of an asset today, including all future cash that it might generate during the time of its life or the time that you own the asset, and what you have to pay for it. So where would that be important? Okay, let's say you're going to buy a rental property and you think you can get $2,000 a month rent, which would increase like 1% a year for the next 25 years. And you got to pay $1 million for that property. How do you know if that's a good investment or not? The way to model that and determine and put at least some objectivity onto that calculus there is this concept of net present value. If I can calculate the present value today of the future cash generated by an asset, and then I can compare that with the cost of the asset in today's money, then I can decide if I've got a good investment or a bad investment. Interest, you know what interest is. It's what you pay to somebody to borrow money off them. And then there's a couple of other things that will are less important for this particular lesson, but we'll come back to them later. So have a read of that. If any of it doesn't make sense, then let's talk about it. And by the way, these are important. I mean, it's kind of boring. I said this was all going to be dead boring. It is, but these things matter, and they show up in life. So why do we want to know about all this? Well, I think I just said all that. Understand present value, future value, rate of return. That's what benefit do you get from an asset. Risk and net present value allows us to make informed choices. Yeah, and bottom bullet kind of does matter. It says if you don't understand this, you don't know what's happening around you financially. You don't understand how insurance companies work, how credit card companies work, how banks work, how the investment community works, and you're flying blind, essentially. Okay. Present value of a stream of future cash flows. So let's start up in, I don't know if my mouse shows up on here, but let's start up in this right-hand corner here where my face is. What we've got here is a timeline. And on this timeline, every year, you're going to receive $1,000. Let's imagine inflation is running at 3%. What is the value of that stream of cash flows today? How do we figure that out? So we're going to get $5,000. That's a given. by the time we get to 2027, you will have received $5,000, but how much is it worth? What can you buy with it? Essentially what happens to each of these $1,000 you receive, it is devaluing at the rate of 3% a year. So every year that passes, the $1,000 becomes worth 3% less. It's still $1,000. It just buys 3% less stuff, less value. So the $1,000 you're going to receive in 2024 is worth 3% less than the $1,000 you got in 2023. The $1,000 you're going to get in 2025 is worth 3% less than the $1,000 you got in 2024. So how much is it worth compared to the $1,000 you got in 2023? Well, that's 3% less squared. It's not additive, it's a multiplicative factor. So that each year that passes, you see this thing erode by 3% year on year. There's a way to represent that mathematically. I didn't put a huge equation here. Instead, what I did was represent it as follows. So here's the present value. It's really $1,000 plus $1,000 divided by 1.03 plus $1,000 divided by 1.03 squared plus it's blah blah blah. You get the message, right? And the longer this goes in the future, the higher that multiplicative power is raised to, based on a number of years in the future in which we get the money. We add it all up, and lo and behold, that $5,000 that we have accumulated over a 5-year period is only worth $4,715. Doesn't sound like a huge deal, but as we get further into this discussion and you learn about compounding, you realize it is actually a very huge deal. Kind of look at the little example in the bottom box there. If somebody's going to give me 15 years time, somebody's going to give me $1,000 and inflation is running at 3%, well, it's worth $642 today. So if I flick back to the example questions and see if, what would I pay somebody today for $1,000 promised to me in 15 years time, if inflation is at 3%, well, I would not pay them more than $642. Otherwise, it would be a bad deal for me. But then let's just apply a little bit of risk to that. Let's say if somebody's trying to offer me that deal and says, hey, Dave, I'll give you $1,000 15 years from now for $600. That's a good deal for you because it's actually worth $642 today. Yeah, that's true mathematically, but what about risk? How do I know what inflation is going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now? That inflation number doesn't have to change by a lot before that the mathematics of that comparison changes, and we'll come on to that. Takeaways from this slide: inflation, which is really a discount rate, reduces the present value of future cash flows. Inflation is cumulative and it compounds in time. It's not additive, its effect compounds, and time has a large effect on this, as you will see in some of the subsequent examples. Okay, that was today's value. What about value in the future? How do we figure that out? Well, just kind of like a reciprocal of the discussion that we just had. We got the same $1,000 a year cash flow, except this time it's we're going to receive it and then invest it and leave it there, and we're going to see what happens in the future. So instead of the money being deflated this time, we're going to see we got a rate of return of 3%. So we're going to invest it in some kind of account that's going to pay us 3% a year. So in 2023, I put $1,000 in. 2024, 1,000. 2025, 1,000. Yada yada yada. And every $1,000 that I put in stays in the account until 2027. And every $1,000 I put in receives 3% per year, compounded. What does that mean? So that means, if I just get real simple, the $1,000 I put in 2023, and I'll leave it there for a year later, somebody's going to give me $30. So instead of having $1,000, I'm going to have $1,030. That $1,030 then compounds at 3%. And in addition, I've put the extra $1,000 in. So when I start the 2024 period, I've got the $1,000 I originally put in, plus I've got the $30 interest, plus I've got the next $1,000 in. So I'm starting in 2024 with $2,030. That $2,030 is then going to attract the 3% rate of return. So we've got another equation here which looks like this. Future value is 1,000 plus 1,000 times 1.03 plus 1,000 times 1.03 squared plus 1,000 times 1.03 cubed, 1,000 times 1.03 to the power of 4. So this last number here would be the effect of the first $1,000 I put in, and the first number in that equation would be the effect of the last $1,000 I put in, because it's not receiving any compounding at all. It's just being stuck in the account at the end of the period. So lo and behold, my $5,000 that I invest over the period is worth $5,309. It's grown in value. A few examples at the bottom there. If I get $1,000 today, it's worth, it's 3%, it's worth 1,558 3 years from now. Then you can look at the other ones. I mean, I guess the interesting one is, if somebody gave me $10,000 today and I invested it at 10%, it's worth over $100,000 25 years from now. So it's gone up by a factor of 10 because of this. The high rate of return, 10% is a high rate of return. 25 years is a reasonably long period of time to invest. So you can turn $10,000 today into over $100,000 25 years from now by doing nothing, by just leaving it in an investment stream. Same comment on risk applies to the previous context on present value. How do I know that I'm always going to get my 3% rate of return? We'll talk about asset classes later on. But different asset classes have different levels of risk and uncertainty. The lower the level of risk, the lower rate of return you're going to get, because institutions will pay less reward, if you like. The reward for investing your money is the rate of return that you're going to get. If it's very low risk, then the investment community will argue that you don't deserve much of reward because you're not taking much risk. You only get reward where there's risk. If you're taking a lot of risk and you're putting your money in a startup company where there is huge uncertainty and high probability of failure, you will expect a higher return. If you're putting your money in GICs where the government is essentially backing the principal, guaranteeing that you're going to get your principal back, you'll get a lower rate of return. And we'll talk about portfolios and how you want to think about that later on, but essentially that's just the principles that you've got to consider relevant to the future value at this point in time. Same takeaways apply. Rate of return grows the future cash flow, as opposed to the previous argument, which decreases the present value. Rate of return, again, compounds and longer time has a longer effect. This theme will continue to emerge. Okay, some real world examples. It's a little bit of a segue just to sort of illustrate what the real consequences of some of this stuff. So this is the value of the S&P 500 since 2000. The S&P 500 is an index of the 500 largest corporations in the US. It's a value-weighted index, so it isn't like everybody's represented equally in the index. That the larger the corporation, the larger the percentage of the index that it occupies. And this, again, we'll talk about that in more detail later. But for this purpose and time, just imagine that when you're investing in the S&P 500, you're essentially investing in the entire US stock market. That's not true, but it's almost true. So what's happened here? Over time, we've got the value of the S&P in this blue curve. The thing to note is fairly obvious that over the long run, it's increased substantially in value. However, a few things that we can take away from this. By the way, the green and red stuff down at the bottom represents the volume of trades, i.e. how many stocks get traded on a whatever the time interval basis is. In this case, it's not quite annually, but you can see, again, over time, more stocks are being traded. That's a function essentially of more retail investors, that would be like us, getting involved in the stock market. So what do we take away from this? Well, it goes up and down, and it goes up and down at different frequencies. It's got these long sort of cycles, and then it's got these little ups and downs that occur over time. So 4 large economic shocks happened since 2000. I mean, there's probably more than that, but I picked 4. The shock is something that essentially brings new information into the evaluation of the value of assets in the market. Something changes, which causes in the investment community to reconsider what it previously understood as the value of an asset. So, first one was the dot-com meltdown and 9/11. Profound impact on the value of the market. If you look at just the value there, I mean, I don't know what the number is because this is a picture, it's not an active graph. You lost, well, at least 50% of the value of the stock market as the dot-com bubble burst around about 2000. And then lo and behold, on September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers thing happened in the US, which had shaped world politics in a massive way, caused uncertainty and concern in the investment community. Asset values collapsed completely. Then you got a sort of slow build up again until 2008. Well, what happened in 2008? The subprime mortgage crisis in the US. What was that all about? It was all about asset prices, primarily real estate, being driven massively high by injection of capital in the economy and by speculation, compounded with bad lending practices from banks in the US, which caused the banks to be exposed to the real estate market. What do I mean by that? So if you're a bank and you lend somebody $1 million to buy a property, and you're charging them interest on it, remember, interest equals reward for the bank, and you get the reward for taking some risk. The risk in this case is, what if Joe Schmo doesn't pay his mortgage back? Then the bank is left holding the baby, which in this case is the house. So if you've got a situation where the banks are tremendously exposed to a real estate market and then the value of that real estate collapses, then there is an increased risk that the bank is not going to get its money back. There's fascinating discussions about what happened in 2008 out there on the web if you want. One of the best movies to watch to learn a little bit about that is The Big Short. It's a highly entertaining movie, and it's pretty factual and close to what actually happened. But what drove that, again, just to sort of dive into that in a bit of detail, because it is interesting, is not only was property massively overvalued, the banks had taken these mortgage assets that they own. So the bank owns the mortgage, it's providing income to the bank in the form of interest. And they packaged these mortgages up into manufactured assets called collateral debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities, where essentially they begin to sell the mortgages to each other. So they disguised their risk. They hid their risk inside of these funds that were comprised of thousands of mortgages. And the argument being, the fund is pretty safe because it's diversified. It isn't just one mortgage, it's thousands of mortgages. The problem was, it was thousands of mortgages that were crap. The properties were highly valued, overvalued, and the mortgage holders, the property owners, weren't qualified to have the mortgages that they were given. Here's how stupid it was in the UK at the time. Banks were lending people more than the principal value of the property. So if you were buying a house for £500,000, the bank would lend you £550,000. So you had £50,000 to go and buy furniture with. The assumption there being that the property is going to go up in price. A year from now, that $500,000 house will be worth £600,000. Sorry, be worth £600,000. So that we're okay. Even if this guy defaults on his mortgage and we have to repossess the house, we're okay because it's going to go up in value. Until it didn't. And that meltdown happened really quickly, and it collapsed the banking system in the US. The US government had to put, I can't remember the numbers now, but it was hundreds of billions of dollars into the banking system to prevent the banking system from collapsing, which would have impacted the world economy. And it was huge. I would encourage you to watch The Big Short. Actually, if you haven't watched it, it's Christian Bale's in it. It's well worth watching. It's It's an entertaining and educational movie. Anyway, notwithstanding that, we got like, what's the interval there? 2003 to 2009. Over a 6-year period, we've gone from one market meltdown to another market meltdown in which massive amounts of asset values disappeared. If you had bought into the stock market early in 2008 at whatever that valuation was there, you saw 50% of your value vanish. We'll get more onto the consequences of that later. What happens next? Well, we got a long, steady climb in the value of the market up until about 2019. So we got more than a decade of fantastic growth in the market. Then what happened? Yeah, we had a big dip. Well, guess what? That was COVID. Massive panic in the world. We got this new virus that is advertised as killing lots of people. Shut down economies, lockdowns, basically shut down economies. Government had to pump a whole bunch of money into the economy to try to keep people able to feed themselves. So they thought at the time. Big impact on the market. But what happened next? Look at that growth curve that comes out of it. It's crazy. The steepest growth in the S&P since 2000. What was behind that? Inflation, largely. It was pending inflation. It was significant amounts of money that were injected into the economy during COVID in order to, essentially prop people up. But when you put a lot of money in an economy, effectively what you're doing is devaluing money. If there's $1,000 worth of goods in the economy and there's $1,000 in the economy, then the average value of a good is $1. If there's $1,000 worth of goods in the economy and there's $2,000 in the economy, then the average price of a good is now $2 of those dollars. So the value of money has decreased. So coincident with this injection of money in the economy, which causes an increase in asset prices, the underlying value of money is decreasing, which is what we saw, a couple of years into COVID, when all of a sudden it is realized that we've got this inflationary pressure in the economy, so the government has to control that. How do they do that? They do that by raising interest rates. We'll have a completely separate discussion on this at some point later on, but suffice to say, at the minute, when the government detects inflation in the economy, the central banks respond by increasing interest rates, which has a dampening effect on the economy. And we drove this big collapse in asset prices. Guess who retired around about the peak there? Me. And as I watched my life savings devalue over the next year or so, that was a scary time. I thought I'd made a hugely bad decision by retiring, but it was what it was. However, you know what, round about the beginning of 2023, end of 22, the market started to recover, and we kind of are where we are at the minute. If you average out all these sort of ups and downs, the little ups and downs and the big ups and downs, then you see a curve that sort of looks like a bit of the beginnings of an exponential curve, which is in fact what it is, because of the compounding effect of the average rate of return in the market. It does produce this geometric function, which is a steadily increasing growth in the value of the market. What does that mean to investors? Well, if you think about this whole idea of long-term investing, you could pick any point in time on this curve and you could say, well, okay, if I'm today, let's say I'm somewhere in this 2012 period, and I'm at that little mini peak that you can see there. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if the market's going to go up or down the next day. I can't tell. So if I'm in and out of the market, I'm always exposing myself to this risk of uncertainty in the market. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I could put $1,000 on a stock today, then tomorrow some new information comes out and hits the news. Everybody dumps that stock, boom, my value goes down, and I'm stuck with a stock that's worth less than I bought it for. On the other hand, I could get lucky. I could pick a little dip in the market. I could pick a little dip there. I could invest some money. Next day, some good news comes out, value of the stock goes up. Point is, I don't know. I'm gambling. What I do know is that over time, in the long run, the value of assets is increasing. At least it has done up to this point in time in human civilization. That's always been the case, subject to the economic shocks that I mentioned earlier. However, if you're invested for long enough and you can afford to leave your investments in play while there are challenges in the market, then you're going to recover. If you can't do that, if you're obliged to, if you need the money that you've invested to live on, and you have to withdraw money to live on, like I do now because I'm retired, then the risk is substantially increased, because when the market decreases, you're forced to sell potentially. So now you've got to sell something for less than you bought it for. If you then want to reinvest in the market and the market starts to recover, you've sold at X. Now you've got to buy again at X plus a bit more. So you own less for the same amount of money. So just a quick study of this curve tells you that investing for the long term is pretty much a given. You're gonna win out in the long term. It also tells you that investing for the short term has a ton of uncertainty, and you can get yourself hurt. Anyway, that's just a bit of real world data that sort of illustrates the implication of this whole time value for money thing. Let's talk about discount rates now. So we've used inflation as a fairly basic discount rate, something that reduces the future value of money. There are other factors that make up discount rates. For most guys like us, retail investors, the only thing we really worry about is inflation. But there are other factors that are important here. Risk-free comparison rate. What does that mean? If I'm going to make a choice about where to put some money, let's say I'm going to put it in the stock market, or I'm going to put it in real estate, or I'm going to put it in bonds. How do I know if that's a good idea? How do I decide what the right idea is? If I can apply a factor that represents how much risk I'm taking in each of these markets, I can then use that factor to compare these investment choices. And we'll talk about that later on. Cost of capital is another form of a discount rate. That's let's say I want to borrow some money to invest. Let's say I can borrow from the bank at 7% and I can get 10% in an investment. Then mathematically that looks like it's a good return. I can pay the bank 7%, I can get paid 10%. I've got 3% difference that I'm putting in my bank account. That sounds great, subject to the risk discussion. How do I know I'm going to get my 10%? And we'll use discount rates in as we go through this discussion. It allows you to compare investments. I've said that. More on that later. Now, for example, discount rates applied to inflation. This is kind of interesting, because what we've got in the economy in Canada, the Bank of Canada is the central bank in Canada. It controls money supply, essentially. And it has a mission to keep inflation within the range of 1 to 3% with a target of 2. Why? Why is inflation A, necessary, and B, bad at the same time? If you have no inflation, that implies your economy is stagnant. If prices are increasing, it implies that buyers aren't engaging in economic activity. They're not out there purchasing stuff, whether it's houses or TVs or cars or new shoes. And sellers are trying to sell. They're trying to sell things. Nobody's buying them. Then you've got inventory sitting around. You've got investment returns are bad. Jobs are bad because, well, business isn't growing. So it's either at best it's level, or worse, it's shrinking. So if it's shrinking, it's laying people off. If people get laid off, then they're less able to buy things, so that the economy becomes even more stagnant. So like zero inflation is not a good thing. I forget the period of time what it was now. It was probably like the 80s, 90s, I think, where Japan had a 10+ year period of stagnation in the economy, like nothing was happening because of this sort of deflationary aspect where prices are actually falling. The flip side of that, though, however, high inflation can result in an economy spiraling out of control from a price perspective. And we've seen that recently in Argentina, seen it in Venezuela, where the economies collapse because prices, the value of money is decreasing, therefore prices are going out of control. In the 30s in Germany, inflation was thousands and thousands of percent. People were carrying money to grocery stores in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread because money was worth nothing. That's the result of an inflationary spiral where economies goes out of control. So let's look at the example in the graph here. This is what's happened in Canada since the government injected billions of dollars into the economy during COVID in the period of 2020 to 2021. So the underlying rate of inflation is bouncing along there at about 2% until 2020, when it starts to climb up and it peaks up at 8%. What does that mean? That means that prices are on average for a basket of goods, and I'll talk about that, increasing at about 8% a year. 8% compounded per year. So every year things increase by about 8%. However, that's not the end of it. The basket of goods is important because the basket of goods is just a list of things that the government says this represents what average Canadians spend their money on. And therefore, if we establish a price for that basket of goods, and then we keep checking that price of that basket of goods over time, it goes up at 8% with inflation. However, the basket of goods doesn't represent everything that you spend your money on. And the government has a propensity to manipulate the basket of goods to make inflation look good, to prop itself up in the polls, if you like. When inflation's going crazy, governments tend to become unpopular. So they manipulate the basket of goods to make things look good. So you kind of got to be careful what you interpret when you're listening to the news and they're talking about inflation. And it's worse than that. When inflation goes up, what did I say a couple of minutes ago? The government uses interest rates as a tool to dampen the economy, to decrease people's enthusiasm for borrowing money to buy things. However, what happens if you've got a mortgage or you've got some form of debt that is subject to variable interest rates? Not only is your spending power of your income being affected by this increase in price driven by inflation, it's also been massively impacted by the price of your mortgage. The interest rate on your mortgage is going up as the price of the basket of goods is going up. So you kind of get hit with this double whammy. That's the situation we're in Canada at the minute. It's going to get worse. Why? So when you get a mortgage and it gets locked in for a period of time, let's say you 4 years ago, you got a mortgage on your house and it was at 4%. So your interest rate is 4%. And imagine you got $1 million mortgage, so you're paying $40,000 a year interest on that mortgage. Let's fast forward to today. Mortgage rates are 7+%. We're going to make it 8% just to keep the math easy. You got your mortgage 4 years ago, you got 1 year to go. A year from now, you're going to renew your mortgage. You're going to go back to the bank and you're going to say to the bank, hey, my mortgage is coming up for renewal. My current deal is 4%. What's my new deal? They're going to say 8%. You're going to fall off your chair because the interest on your $1 million mortgage isn't $40,000 a year anymore. It's $80,000. So your mortgage payment is likely to double. So in addition to your basket of goods increasing at 8% a year, your mortgage is going to double. So you're substantially exposed to financial risk when that happens. There is a risk, and I don't know, I can't quantify how high it is, in all honesty. I don't think it's zero. I don't think it's 100%. But it's reasonably high. There is a risk that what we'll see in Canada in the next year or so is increasing pressure on the housing market as mortgages come up for renewal and people can't afford to pay their new mortgages. What do you do then? Or perhaps you don't even qualify for a refinancing of your mortgage. You go to the bank and you say, hey, my $1 million mortgage is coming up for renewal. What's the deal on a new mortgage? And the bank manager says, I'm sorry, mate, you don't have enough income to qualify for the mortgage that you've already had. Then what do? You're essentially screwed, because you can't get a mortgage on the home that you're living in. What do you do then? Well, you got to sell it. In a declining market, it can take a while to sell your house. So you bought the house for $1 million 4 years ago. It's probably gone up in value now because, you know, real estate prices climbed substantially during COVID. So let's say it's worth more than $1 million, but you got to sell it fast because your mortgage is about to expire and the bank wants their money. They want their money back because you won't have a mortgage. So you've got to sell your house at a discount. In the worst case, you got to sell your house for less than what you owe the bank. So you sell your house for $900,000 to get it off the market quickly. You got to pay the bank $1 million. We haven't got $1 million. You've only got 900,000. So you've got no house and you owe the bank $100,000 still. This happens, and it happened a lot in 2008, and resulted in people basically having to declare bankruptcy, walk away from the houses. The bank repossesses the house and they sell it on the market for, you know, cents on the dollar to get as much as they can out of it. And you know, you're left with no home. You're bankrupt. You've got a file that says your credit rating isn't worth shit because you're a bankrupt client, and you're financially in a bad place. That wiped people out in the 2008 period, and there was real risk of that happening to significant chunks of the population in Canada, particularly in the sort of more dynamic housing markets like Vancouver and Toronto. So what will the government do about that, or what will the central banks do about that? They're already trying to do certain things now. I mean, they're trying to advertise that inflation's coming down. So guess what? We might be able to relax interest rates a bit. That will help. They're talking about allowing people to amortize their mortgages over like 40 years or 50 years so that your payments are less. That makes mortgages in the near term more affordable, but it has a significant impact on people's ability to become financially independent because they've got this albatross of a mortgage around their lives for 40 years instead of 25 years. None of this is good. It bodes badly for, you know, young Canadians trying to get into the housing market. It could have a profound effect on the Canadian economy. And in the worst case, if the banks were affected, if enough people defaulted on their mortgages, we could end up with a bit of a banking crisis, like what happened in the US in 2008. People are already talking about that, and they argue that it won't happen because the Canadian banking system was more conservative than the US banking system was back then. That's another discussion we can have if you guys are interested in that. But it's not good. It's not a great place to be in the minute. Sorry, it sounds kind of depressing, this stuff, but it's all important. It all factors into your thinking about how you conduct yourself financially in life. The last point on this is that even if inflation comes down, and they are now talking about it hovering around 4%, I don't believe it, because I think they're manipulating the basket of goods. If you look at the price of food and things, it's not leveling off. Gas has helped. You know, gas came down in price, and gas is part of the bundle of goods, and gas prices impact other factors in the economy. So when gas prices come down, inflation tends to come down. So there's a bit of a benefit that the government received from that because of gas being in that basket of goods. But I don't believe that inflation, food inflation particularly, I don't believe is at 4%. And it was notwithstanding. So another application of this stuff to the real world. We mentioned different investable assets before there. One of them was a GIC. I just randomly picked this off the Bank of Montreal website. They offer a GIC, which is a guaranteed investment certificate. By the way, nothing's guaranteed, but they call it a guaranteed investment certificate. So what happens here is you give the bank a chunk of money, and in return they say, okay, we'll give you a certain interest rate on that money, and 2 years from now we'll give you your money back. This one happens to be 4%. So Bank of Montreal are essentially saying, you give us $1,000, we'll give you 4% this year, well, at the end of this year, and then we'll give you 4% at the end of next year. Or we'll give you it monthly, depending on how the GIC is structured. And they say, oh, you get 100% principal protection, regardless of what happens in the market. That's like 99.9% true. It's never guaranteed. Like nothing in life is guaranteed except death and taxes. However, because it's guaranteed, the rate of return is low. It's 4%. So let's think about this. What are you getting here? Well, here's another little timeline. So you put your $1,000 in it in 2023. You get your $40 interest a year later. Then another year later, you get your $40 interest, plus you get your $1,000 back. So what's the equation for this? Okay, what have I really received here? Well, I've received $40 divided by the rate of inflation, 1.03. Then I've received $1,040 2 years later, so divided by 1.03 squared. So the present value, today's value of what I've actually received is not $1,080, which would be the actual amount of cash that I've received. I've received $1,019 in value. So I've put my $1,000 to work. Notionally, I'm getting $80 return for that, but I'm not. I'm getting $80 in cash, but it ain't worth $80 because of inflation. Discounting, it's only worth $1,019 today. So when I'm deciding what to do with that $1,000, I'm thinking to myself, well, I can put it in a GIC and I can get 4% a year, which would give me a present value today of $1,019. That can form one comparison point for a choice about what do I do with my money, how do I invest it. If, for example, I've got $1,000 balance on a credit card and I'm paying 24% interest on the credit card, I would be insane to buy a GIC paying 4%. By the way, that $19 that are the value that I return, the $80 of cash, which is really worth $19, is taxable. So I've got to give the government some of that as well. Versus if I just pay my $1,000 off my credit card, which is charging me 24%, that's not taxable, it's not income. So I'm getting 24% return on a credit card with no risk. It's like guaranteed. When I pay that $1,000 off that credit card, that $1,000 worth of debt is gone. The interest that would be charged on that $1,000 of debt is gone, guaranteed today. Versus I buy my GIC and I put it and let it sit there for 2 years, and a couple of years' time I get my $1,000 back, but it ain't worth $1,000 anymore. So time is eroding the value of my money in this case. The important point to take away from this being that the idea of future value and present value as a comparison tool for deciding whether or not something is a good way to invest, in this case $1,000. And this is real. This is not me making shit up. This is a real GIC off the Bank of Montreal website with real returns. Apply the math to it, that's what you get. Oh yeah, sorry, I should mention this on here as well. This idea of opportunity cost. That little pitch I just gave you there about the idea of, do I put it in this or do I put it off a credit card? That idea is introduces this thing of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost essentially says, whatever course of action I take has a cost. I have an opportunity to do this, or I have an opportunity to do that, or I have an opportunity to do something else. Each of these opportunities has a value and a cost, and we'll talk about that more later. In fact, right now, you can tell I can't remember the order I put the slides in here, so I'll catch myself by surprise. So yeah, so here is what is opportunity cost. Put simply, it's the missed benefit that a consumer or a firm chooses to pass on in order to obtain the actual benefits of something else. Behind my face there's a little sort of road sign that kind of with a guy standing thinking, like, which way do I go here? What do I do? Opportunity cost helps you make those decisions. So I use an example. If I go on holiday, what does it actually cost me to go on holiday? Well, it costs me, in economic terms, it costs me the value of the holiday, what I will spend when I'm on holiday, the earnings that I would have earned had I not been on holiday, and the future returns I could get from that. So it's crazy. So I'm spent $5,000 on a skiing trip. Okay, I come back from the ski trip a week later. I've got a bit of a suntan and maybe a bad leg because I hurt myself skiing, and I've had a good time, kind of thing. So that's great. But I no longer have the $5,000. So what did that holiday cost me? Did it cost me $5,000? Yes, in today's money, it cost me $5,000. But that holiday produces no economic return. It's not an asset. Other than it's a life asset, it creates memories perhaps, but it doesn't create income. If instead I'd put that $5,000 in the in some form of investment vehicle, in the future I would have a lot more than $5,000. Thinking back to that slide about long-term investing at a rate of 10%, and I got in 25 years, my $10,000 that I invested at 10% was worth $108,000. So it's gone up by a factor of 10. That same $5,000 that I just spent on the skiing trip, I could have put in the S&P 500, left it there for 25 years, and in 25 years it would be worth 50 grand. Which obviously 50 grand in 25 years is not the same as 50 grand today. Inflation would take some of that value away. However, it's going to be worth a lot more than $5,000. So I made a choice there to, instead of having that capital in the future, I had a skiing holiday. I probably didn't go through the mental gymnastics of establishing the opportunity cost. I probably just thought, shit, I want to go on a skiing holiday. And I forego the opportunity, the future opportunity of investing that money. That's kind of what opportunity cost is about. It isn't always about holidays, and we'll get more into that. Talk about a cottage. Only I bought the cottage. It cost us whatever it cost us. I can't remember how much it was, to be honest. It was about, all in it was about 300 and something $1,000. If I'd not bought it, I could have put that same amount of money in the stock market, and by now, given what's happened to the markets over the last few years, it probably would have been close to doubled. And I could have been getting income from it. Like my income in retirement would have been higher if I hadn't had the cottage. Let's say, I don't know what it's worth now, but let's imagine it's worth $500,000. If I had $500,000 in a bunch of Canadian stocks paying dividends at the minute, I could probably be earning easily $15,000 a year worth of income instead of having a cottage. So what have I got instead? Well, I've got a cottage that's gone up in value, but I can't spend it. It's just there. And I got to pay insurance for it. I got to pay, to heat the thing in the winter. I got to pay property taxes. I got to fix things when they go wrong. So I'm actually net spending money on a cottage instead of having money coming in. So from an opportunity cost perspective, I'm giving up on some of those things, but what do I get in return? Well, I get to hang out in the cottage. I get to have time there with my family. I get to have memories. I get to hopefully hang on to it for the rest of my life, and I can make it available for my family when I'm gone. That's a choice I'm making, but there is a cost to that choice. That's the opportunity cost. And I guess the getting back to the 80% of this is behavior, 20% is knowledge thing. The behavioral aspect of this is about being conscious about these opportunity costs. It's not saying that you always are going to pick the best economic choice, because life isn't just an equation about economics, it's about life. But by understanding opportunity cost as a concept, you can make more conscious decisions. You can think things through differently. It's subjective. Opportunity cost is an individual thing. Like for me, I like having a cottage. I like being able to go there with you guys. I like being able to spend time there and sit on the deck and watch the sunset. That's worth a lot to me. But I ought to be conscious of it. And there might come a time in our lives where we can't hang on to that for the rest of our life. We might need to sell it to provide for our, finances, and I would have to consider that at the time. Opportunity cost can be objectified by using notions of present value, future value, rate of return, and net present value, which we'll kind of get onto further. Here's a little example. I can let you read this. It's simple, but it basically says Joe just gets himself $1,000 bonus. What's he going to do with it? Should he buy a bond mutual fund or pay off his mortgage? His mortgage is 6%. The mutual fund has a historical return of 10%, which he's going to hold forever. How does he decide what his best decision is? Well, if he invests in the bonds fund, he's going to get this return. He's going to get $100 a year. Well, guess what? He's going to pay tax on it at 33%. So he's left with $67 a year in after-tax income, which he can reinvest or he can spend, versus where he pays down his mortgage. Each year, his mortgage is 6%. So each year, his mortgage interest is $60 less than it used to be. That's not taxable. That's just $60 worth of avoided cost. It's not income. He can reinvest the $60 or he can spend it. What should he do? Well, again, if you just look at the numbers, you would say, well, wait a sec, $67 is better than $60, so I should probably buy the bond fund, except for the risk factor that bonds are not guaranteed to hold their value. The mortgage rates aren't guaranteed to stay constant. What if Joe has to finance his, when's his mortgage going to expire and he has to refinance his mortgage? What's the new interest rate going to be? Does he have penalties if he pays down his mortgage? Bonds can decrease in value. If interest, we'll talk about bonds later on, but if interest rates increase and if they go up like they are now, the value of bonds goes down. So whatever Joe paid for the bond, he's not guaranteed he's going to get that back when the bond expires. And then there's the old issue with credit cards and other factors in life. Like does Joe have a credit card balance? If he does, he's much better off paying that down. Or what if Joe's kid needs braces or something else? Some life factor gets in the way. If Joe buys the bond fund, then 6 months later he has to sell it to pay his kids' braces off, and the value's gone down, and he's stuck with that undervalued bond. So again, life gets in the way here. It's not all about mathematics; it's about life, and you got to do the opportunity cost thing to figure this out. Here's another example. I got an old truck now. Not an old truck, it's a pretty good truck. I kind of like it, but I could get a new one for roughly 75 grand. In fact, not me, Joe. Joe has an option to finance the truck, or he can sell some of his stocks to buy it outright cash. If he buys it cash, he gets a $5,000 discount, or he can walk away and keep his old truck. What does he do? Okay, what does he consider? There's a whole list of things that Joe should consider there. Total cost of financing, the opportunity cost of selling assets. So if I sell those stocks to buy the truck and then the stock market takes off, I've lost out on the gain that I would have had I not taken the money out of the stock market. If I sell assets to raise the $75,000 or the $70,000 I need to buy the truck, I'm going to pay tax on any capital gains associated with that. What's the opportunity cost of buying the truck at all? What if I just didn't do it? Instead, I just let things be the way they are. What about my lifestyle? Is my existing truck about to fall apart and I need transport? I got it. Just like kind of got to do this. What's the lifetime of the truck? How long is it going to last? What's going to be worth in the future? How much do I have to pay to maintain the thing? What if I lose my job and I can't afford the payments, but I've got this financing thing going on? How do I make that decision? So again, I've simplified this and we said, let's look at like these three scenarios. I can finance it. It's easy to figure out how much that costs. You go on the web, you find a loan calculator tool and it spits out the numbers. Over the 5-year financing deal, Joe will pay $16,000 plus in interest. Total cash you'll pay for the truck is over $90,000. But that's not the end of it. What if he withdrew the cash instead? What would it cost him? Okay, so if he's pulling out $70,000, remember he got a $5,000 discount, so he's getting a bit of a deal on the truck. and he's got a portfolio of assets, his lost opportunity would result in $104,000 worth of value being spent on the truck. What if he just didn't buy the truck, and instead of either borrowing money or instead of withdrawing his assets, he just left it there? The future value in 5 years' time of those payments would be $111,000. So what's Joe's comparison here? Well, if he didn't buy it all, he would have, and he invested the financing. So he's arguing to himself that he can afford $1,500 a month to pay for a truck. Well, what if he didn't do that? What if he just kept his old truck, put his $15,000 a month into the stock market, left these $70,000 that he had already invested? What's he got at the end of 5 years? Well, he's got $216,000 worth of value. He hasn't got a truck except his old one, but he's got $216,000. If he finances the truck at the end of 5 years, he'll have the $104,000 return that he got off his 70 grand that he didn't use because he financed it instead, and he'll have a 5-year-old truck. If he buys it cash, so he sells his stocks, buys the truck, he'll have $111,000 and a 5-year-old truck. Let's assume the truck's worth 25 grand in 5 years. His best case, he's got a 136,000 worth of future value compared to 216,000 if he didn't buy the truck. It's cost him, in economic terms, nearly 16 grand a year to own that truck. So, that does the numbers. Again, I've said ignoring tax consequences because that actually makes it slightly worse. But what does Joe do? He's got a decision to make, and he can look at the numbers now, and he can make an informed choice based on the economics and lifestyle factors, and decide, what do I do? Opportunity cost is a tool that allows you to make informed choices. Again, you can still make a bad decision. It could be a bad decision to go buy the truck by any means, because you're foregoing $216,000 worth of value for the sake of having a new truck, when the old one might have worked perfectly well for the next 5 years. But on the other hand, there might be a reason why you want a reliable truck, because maybe the old one breaks down all the time. You don't want to risk getting stuck somewhere with a kid, so you got to bite the bullet and you're going to spend the money. Compounding, probably the most important topic on time value of money. This idea of compounding, especially when considered over a long period of time. So, a little bit of mathematics here. The future value is the present value times 1 plus your rate of return to the power of n. N is the number of periods over which you allow compounding to occur. We're going to use years because it makes life easier. And we're going to say, imagine 30 years. Your rate of return is the interest or the gain, effectively, that you get per period while the asset is invested. In this case, 30 years, and we're going to use 7.5% as an example. So rather than stress out on the math, let's just say, what does it look like? So in these two cases, on the left, I've started with $1,000 that I just invested and left it there for 30 years. At the end of 30 years, it's worth a little bit over $8,000, which I get for doing nothing. I get that for just having put the $1,000 in there and left it there. That's pretty cool. What's even cooler is the picture on the right, where you invest each period. This is $1,000 per year. So if you invest $1,000 per year, like $20 a week. So it's like 3 Starbucks, 3 Grande Lattes from Starbucks is $20 a week, $1,000 a year. You invest 3 Grande Lattes a week for 30 years, and you're getting 7.5% return, which is less than the aggregate average for the S&P 500 in the long run. You got over $100,000 over that 30-year period. So your 3 Grande Lattes a week, by the time you get to 30 years in the future, will have cost you over $100,000 worth of value 30 years from now. And that's for $20 a week. If it's $40 a week, it's twice that. And if the rate of return is 10% instead of 7.5%, it's more again. Like it's profound, the impact of time in the market. Can't emphasize that enough. I mean, like for me now to think about that, I'm too old to really benefit from much of that. When you guys are thinking about how to plan your financial future, you got to get your heads around this, and you got to start now. The old adage, like, when's the best time to plant a tree? 25 or 30 years ago. When's the second best time to plant that tree? Today. You got to find a way to do this. You got to, like, back to lesson 0, right? Like, get to the point where you got positive cash flow that you can invest. You can do that by earning more or spending less or both. But if you can create 3 Starbucks a week worth of financial headroom and invest it in the S&P 500 and leave it there for 30 years, it's worth over $100,000. At some point in this course, we'll get on to how much are you going to need to retire in your future, and it'll scare the shit out of you when you hear that number. And that'll not be to have a lavish lifestyle. That'll be to, keep warm and keep dry and feed yourselves and hopefully enjoy a bit of life. It'll be a big number and it'll scare the shit out of you. You can avoid a shit life later on by thinking ahead a little bit today and starting to make some sacrifices and benefit from the power of compounding and the time that you've got in the market. In your mid-30s now, if you want to retire at 65, you've got 30 years. You've got that period of time. This is not a bullshit model. 7.5% is a perfectly reasonable long-term rate of return. You can create wealth for yourself if you give yourself plenty of time and you adopt the right thinking and behaviors. What do we take away from this? Money and time are related. That's the time value of money. Time is your friend. I don't know how many times I've got to say that. I'll keep coming back to that. Time is your friend and patience matters. Opportunity cost consideration helps you make better decisions. What's the opportunity cost of $108,000 30 years from now? Well, it's 3 Granny Lattes a week or 2 beers a week if you go to the pub. Compounding and regular investments leads to massive returns. Again, the compounding and regular investment in the long run allows you to ride through economic ups and downs in the market that are inevitably going to happen. Warren Buffett, one of the most famous investors in the world, will talk about times when the value of Berkshire Hathaway was reduced by 50% and they didn't sell. They just sit there and they ride it through. In order to be able to do that, you got to be at a point where you invest in money that you don't need today. The idea of saying, well, okay, I got $50 today, I'm going to need it next week, so I'll invest it for a week is not the model that's applied here. That essentially leads to eventual catastrophe. You don't need fancy strategies and complicated investments and things you don't understand. You need simple, disciplined, patient investing and good judgment to avoid big mistakes. I made a few big mistakes earlier on, and my journey of saving up to invest in it, I don't even want to know how much it cost me because it's freaking scary. Know when you need help and get it. There's lots of resources around to help you with this stuff, and there's tons of information on the web. You just have to become curious about it and genuinely interested and seek to improve your own knowledge and awareness of this stuff and put it into practice. And anybody who invests for long enough can accumulate substantial capital. That's like the good news story in this whole thing. You do not have to be a whiz kid. You don't have to go to Harvard Business School. You don't have to invest in complicated things. You just got to be disciplined and patient, and you'll accumulate substantial capital. So that's it for this one. This was a long one. Apologies for that. I hope it was useful, and look forward to the next lesson.